What we are dealing with in egalitarianism is an ideology that serves various social and political and even psychological functions. In fact, egalitarianism, since the progressive era of the early 20th century, and especially since the New Deal, has become at first an unofficial and increasingly an official ideology of the system in which we live, the government, the dominant culture, and even the economy of the United States and the Western world. Egalitarianism has become an ideology that protects, serves, and rationalizes the interests of the elites that hold power in Western society, just as doctrines like the divine right of kings serve the interests of monarchies and aristocracies before the French Revolution. Roger Pearson points to this role of egalitarianism in his chapter on the Rushton case when he writes, Rushton's research had carried him into an area of direct economic and political significance. His findings had uncovered flaws in the established version of environmentalist social science testimony on which massive government programs had been built in both Canada and the USA. These not only provided for a massive redistribution of wealth and reverse discrimination in employment, but had provided a vested interest for millions of beneficiaries. His findings also threatened the well-being of organizations that had been built on the surplus funds, which could be culled from supervising this redistribution of wealth, and also had potentially adverse implications for the immigration industry. Little did Rushton realize that his seemingly innocent research would stir up such a tempest. Those on the left knew the crucial importance of the data he was studying and of the need to keep the public from accepting his opinions, as well as preventing other scholars from daring to speak their minds on the issues involved. I think that understanding egalitarianism as the ideology of an elite is important for several reasons. In the first place, it puts the Marxists and radicals of the left in an entirely different light from the one in which they like to present themselves, that of rebels against the system. Invariably, when Marxist groups protest against racism, they argue that racism is the tool of capitalism, that a capitalist ruling class promotes racism in order to justify the exploitation of non-whites and to keep white and non-white proletariats divided. But in reality, there's no truth whatsoever in this theory. If it were true, we would expect academics like Rushton and Levin, Arthur Jensen and Richard Herrenstein to have received millions in grants from large corporations and foundations. In fact, they receive little or nothing. And the grants those institutions do make do not support hereditarian views of social problems, but rather environmentalist and egalitarian views. It was, after all, the Carnegie Foundation that provided Gunnar Myrdal with $300,000 to produce An American Dilemma, for years the Bible of racial egalitarian environmentalism. The truth is that when Marxists and self-described radicals denounce what they call racism, they are in fact performing as the ideological vanguard of the real elites that hold power and which possess enormous vested interest in egalitarianism and environmentalism. It is the radical egalitarians and anti-hereditarians who are the real running dogs of the system, and not those who challenge egalitarianism and environmentalism. And it is the hereditarians like Rushton and Levin who are the real radicals or even revolutionaries who challenge the lies and mythologies in which entrenched powers always mask themselves. In the second place, understanding egalitarianism as the ideology of the system and the elites that run it ought to alter our view of how the system and its elites actually operate. Most elites in history have always had a vested interest in preserving the societies they rule, and that is why most elites have been conservative. The British aristocracy up to the 20th century is a fairly typical example of such a conservative elite. But the elite that has come to power in the United States and the Western world in this century actually has a vested interest in managing and manipulating social change, the destruction of the society it rules. Political analyst Kevin Phillips pointed this out in his 1975 book, Mediocrity, which is a study of the emergence of what he calls the new knowledge elite, the members of which approach society from a new vantage point. Change does not threaten the affluent intelligentsia of the post-industrial society the way it threatened the landowners and industrialists of the New Deal. On the contrary, change is as essential to the knowledge sector as inventory turnover is to a merchant or a manufacturer. Change keeps up demand for the product, research, news, theory, and technology. Post-industrialism, a knowledge elite, and accelerated social change appear to go hand in hand. The new knowledge elite does not preserve and protect existing traditions and institutions. On the contrary, far more than previous new classes, the knowledge elite has sought to modify or replace traditional institutions with new relationships and power centers. And egalitarianism and environmentalism serve this need to create and manage social change perfectly. Traditional institutions can be depicted not only as unequal and oppressive, but also as pathological, requiring the social and economic therapy that only the knowledge elite is skilled enough to design and apply. The interests of the knowledge elite in managing social change happen to be entirely consistent not only with the agendas of the hard left, but also with the grievances and demands of various racial and ethnic groups that view racism and prejudice as obstacles to their own advancement. So that what we see is an alliance between the new elites and organized racial and ethnic minorities to undermine and displace the traditional institutions and beliefs of white Euro-American society, which just happen to be the power centers of older elites based on wealth, land, and status. This process of displacement or dispossession is always described as progressive, liberating, or diversifying, when in fact it merely helps consolidate the dominance of a new class and weaken the power and interests of its rivals. Furthermore, what this understanding of the real meaning of egalitarianism leads to is that when we see university deans and presidents, quote, caving in to the demands of the hard left, they are not really displaying traits of weakness and appeasement. Universities are the breeding grounds of egalitarianism and its applications to society by the elites, and hence they occupy a special and strategic place in the functioning of the system. If the ideology of egalitarianism were abandoned, many of the functions that universities now perform in the way of research and much of what their faculties do in designing egalitarian social programs and therapy would become obsolete. When the universities cave in to the left, therefore, they are simply, in reality, pursuing their own interests, which are to preserve the political ideology of egalitarianism intact and suppress or silence those who dissent from it. And then they are, in that respect, in fact, behaving like any elite, like the French aristocracy of the 18th century, for example, when it punished Enlightenment writers who challenged aristocratic ideologies. Their behavior appears to be weak or degenerate or renegade to us because we look at their conduct from the point of view of those who believe the consequences of egalitarianism are harmful and have to live with those consequences. And also because most of us continue to harbor the illusion that the elites that now prevail in this country and much of the West are still in some sense our elites, that they represent us, when in fact they mainly represent themselves and their class interests and the ideology and agendas that serve those interests. I think understanding egalitarianism today as the ideology of a dominant elite that uses it to serve its own interests may suggest ways in which we could more successfully confront the ideology and those it serves. In the past, most of those who have challenged egalitarianism in one form or another have done so through what we might call rationalistic means. That is, they have tried to cite scientific or empirical evidence logically assembled to offer the challenge. Certainly that is an important and indeed crucial element of the challenge. But whatever its rational and scientific merits, it has not been enough. As Pearson points out, none of Levin's critics, and not many of Rushton's either, was interested in debating their ideas or dealing with their scientific validity. Of course not. What their critics were interested in was power and in preventing Rushton, Levin, and others from challenging that power. and that is exactly the point at which they should be attacked and exposed. What we need to do, in addition to building the scientific and scholarly case against egalitarianism and environmentalism, is to take a page from the book of the left, to expose those who resist scientific evidence and who respond to it only with lies and repression as the beneficiaries of the egalitarian ideology they are trying to protect. We need to show that an entire political and economic industry gains wealth and power from egalitarian environmental ideology, and in a word, unmask or deconstruct those interests.